The familiar scent of antiseptic still clung to my blouse as I locked the back door of the veterinary clinic, my fingers fumbling for the keys in the cool October darkness drifting through Boston. 7 years working at Willow Haven Animal Care had taught me the difference between an ordinary evening and a night that could quietly alter the course of a life. Tonight should have been nothing more than a late shift, a final check of the cages, a fresh bowl of water for the newborn kittens, then taking little Sophie home. I heard her giggling in the break room, playing with her stuffed bear Max, the soft sound floating through the dim space as the faint glow of the streetlight spilled across the glass door and the wind rustled through the maple trees shedding their leaves. I sighed, thinking about the electric bill due soon and the stack of paperwork Rachel had left on my desk. But then the sharp screech of an SUV braking hard cut through the quiet, making me turn abruptly. A tall man stepped out quickly, dressed in a dark jacket and a pulled-down cap, carrying a golden retriever whose fur was matted with blood and whose breath rattled in distress. "Are you the veterinarian?" he asked, his voice firm yet strangely courteous. I nodded before my mind even caught up, pushing the door open wide as instinct overtook thought. "The dog was shot," he said simply, placing the animal on the operating table. I bent down, examining the wound on the left shoulder, the blood still seeping steadily. "We do not ask questions at this hour," I said quickly, sliding on gloves and motioning for him to hold the dog steady. "Is anyone with you?" I asked while preparing the pain medication. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving the animal. For a brief second, I caught sight of a gun tucked beneath his jacket, mostly hidden but enough for my heartbeat to stumble. "What is his name?" I asked as I began stitching the wound. "Charlie," he answered quietly. The ordinary softness of the name made me pause, because it had also belonged to my childhood dog. Sophie peeked out from the break room doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of the blood. "Go back inside, sweetheart," I said quickly, forcing calm into my voice. The man glanced at her, and his eyes seemed to hesitate for a beat, his breath slowing in a way I could not decipher. Yet he said nothing. I kept working, focused but uneasy. He was too calm, too composed in a moment that should have rattled anyone, and in his eyes there was something I could not stop noticing. A quiet sorrow, worn and old, as if he had lost more than most people could endure, or had walked away from something precious. Nearly an hour later, the procedure was done. Charlie slept under the anesthetic, his breathing steady. I removed my gloves, wiped my brow, and prepared to log the case when the man extended a business card. "If anything happens, call this number. I will handle all expenses," he said. I looked down at the embossed lettering and felt my heart halt for a fleeting second. Dominic Russo Holdings Group. That name? Impossible. I lifted my eyes slowly. The face, the familiar angle of his jaw, the deep brown eyes that once felt like home. There was no mistaking him. It was him, the man who had vanished from my life nearly a decade ago without a single explanation. Dominic. And in that moment, he looked at me too. For a long, breathless stretch of time, his expression flickering with shock, confusion, and perhaps something heavier, guilt. The room fell unbearably silent. On the table, Charlie whimpered softly in his drug-induced sleep, while I stood frozen, my hands trembling as the past rushed over me like the first icy draft of early winter, pressing into all the places I thought I had sealed shut. If you are following every tense heartbeat between Dominic and me, every buried secret rising in the quiet of this Boston night, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so we can keep bringing you stories filled with depth and emotion each day. And tell me, where are you listening from? Leave a comment with your city or country so I know how far this journey of mine and my daughter's has reached. Dominic stood there, still with that same gaze that once made my young heart flutter through the summers of a decade past. His hair was trimmed neatly now, his features sharper and more mature, yet I could recognize him anywhere. He was Dominic Russo, the man who disappeared from my life just as I discovered I was pregnant, my vision blurred at the edges, my pulse pounding like a drum in a hollow room. I tried to steady myself, staring at the business card as if I needed external proof that all of this was real. Dominic said nothing more. We simply stood there in a silence so heavy it felt alive, as though the past had never truly gone to sleep. From the break room, Sophie called out, "Mama, I am hungry," her innocent voice slicing through the space between us like a thin, unexpected blade. Dominic's eyes shifted instantly at the sound, a flicker breaking through his composure, as if he had brushed against a memory he did not yet dare to claim. He removed his hand from his pocket and placed an envelope on the table. "I know this is not the right time, but thank you for saving Charlie. If you need anything, I will handle it," he said, his voice low and steady. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away quickly, as if fleeing from the truth that had just risen between us. I heard the door close, the engine start, and within moments the SUV disappeared into the cold mist of the Boston night. I stood in place, numb and shaken, caught somewhere between shock, anger, and disbelief. He had returned, after nearly 10 years, without a single explanation, not one message, not one word. In all those years, I survived everything alone, gave birth alone, returned to school, worked while raising a child, and taught myself to forget him. I convinced myself Dominic was a chapter closed by fate, a man I had once loved with everything I had, but who had vanished as if he never existed. But tonight shattered all of that. He was back, and he was the father of my daughter. I took a slow, steady breath, removed my gloves, and walked into the break room, forcing a smile as if nothing had happened. Sophie looked up at me with bright, curious eyes. "Mama, who was that?" "The man with the cute dog," she asked. I sat beside her, smoothing her hair gently. "Just a customer, sweetheart. Let us go home." But inside, I knew this was not a coincidence. It could not be. Dominic Russo was not the kind of man who rushed a dog to the clinic in the middle of the night. He had once been a brilliant student with ambitions too big to fit into a simple life, carrying family complications he rarely spoke about. I remembered the one thing he told me back then. "There are things you would not want to know about where I come from." And then he was gone, as if I had never mattered. I looked at Sophie and saw my own youth reflected in her face, but also Dominic's, unmistakably. The deep brown eyes, the quiet strength. I had hidden the truth for so many years because I believed he would never return. But now he had, and I did not know whether that was a gift or a warning from fate itself. On the table, the business card still glimmered under the fluorescent light, his name sharp and commanding. Dominic Russo was no longer the young man I once knew. He was a man who had lived a different life, carrying secrets I had never come close to understanding. And from that moment on, I knew my peaceful life with my daughter would never be the same again. The next morning, when I returned to the clinic, pale sunlight filtered through the large glass window and washed over the metal table where the golden retriever, Charlie, was still sleeping soundly after surgery. The wound on his shoulder had been carefully bandaged, his heartbeat steady, his breathing even. I watched him curled up, his golden fur now clean of blood, and an unfamiliar feeling rose quietly in my chest. It was not only because I had saved a life, but because the night before I had unexpectedly come face to face with a past I thought had been buried for good. Rachel walked in with a cup of hot coffee, handed it to me, and said softly, "I heard you stayed late last night. Anything unusual?" I hesitated for a moment before shaking my head. Just an emergency case. I did not have the words nor the strength to tell her that the man who brought in the wounded dog was the father of my daughter. The man I once loved so deeply I could have given up everything just to be with him, and also the same man who walked away without a single goodbye. I held the cup quietly and stepped into my office. On the desk, the envelope he left behind was still untouched. I knew I could not ignore it any longer. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten check for $10,000 along with a small note that read, "For Charlie, and for your kindness, thank you." There was no phone number, nothing else except the neatly tucked business card. The card was embossed on thick paper with silver trim, the words Dominic Russo Holdings Group standing bold in the center. The address listed a top-floor office in Boston's financial district, inside one of those towering skyscrapers I once passed with Sophie when she asked, "Who lives way up there, Mama?" Now I had an answer. Dominic had not only returned, he had become someone entirely different, a powerful, wealthy man with influence and a whole history I had never truly known. I wondered how someone who once dreamed of owning a little book cafe in the countryside could become the head of a major real estate corporation, and why he appeared at this moment, why he brought an injured dog specifically to my clinic. Was it coincidence, or did he already know everything? I tightened my hold on the business card as my heart thudded strangely against my ribs. I did not know whether he had realized Sophie was his daughter, but the way he looked at her last night, there was no way he had not recognized it. He gazed at her as if he were staring at a smaller reflection of himself. I dropped into my chair, pressing the business card to my forehead, my mind tangled with questions. If he had come back, could I allow him into my daughter's life after all the years he had been absent? And could I place trust in a man like Dominic Russo, no longer the idealistic young dreamer he once was, but someone wrapped in power, secrecy, and truths I could not grasp? The door suddenly opened, and Rachel peeked in. "Emily, a man just called asking about the dog from last night." I jumped up, slipped the card into the drawer, and said quickly, "Put the call through." My voice felt strangely tight. The phone rang only a few seconds later. I answered, my chest tightening. "Willow Haven Animal Care. This is Dr. Emily Carter." On the other end, a deep, gentle voice. "This is Dominic. I just wanted to know how Charlie is doing." In that brief moment, all the years that had passed, every memory and every wound I thought time had softened, came rushing back as though none of it had ever left me. 3 days after that call, everything seemed to settle back into something like normal, at least on the surface. Charlie was recovering well, eating again, walking slowly around the post-op room. Sophie would not stop asking about the golden dog she now called the cutest in the world, and Rachel still brewed coffee far too strong as always. I tried to push Dominic out of my mind, but each time the clinic door chimed or the phone rang, my heart leapt in ways I could not explain. I kept telling myself it had been nothing more than an unexpected night, a brief collision with fate, and it would pass. But on Monday morning, when I arrived at the clinic, I found a thick envelope placed on my desk with no sender, only my name written in elegant script. I opened it, and a chill ran up my spine. Inside was a luxurious invitation printed on heavy ivory paper with gold lettering that read, "Dr. Emily Carter is cordially invited to the Boston Hope Animal Rescue Charity Gala, hosted by Russo Holdings Group." I froze. Dominic's name was there again, no longer just a shadow from the past, but the host of the entire event. The invitation included a map and details of the venue, a lavish hotel on Copley Square, and most striking of all was the final line, "Evening attire will be provided. A private car will arrive at your residence at 6 o'clock on Friday evening." I did not know whether to feel angry, afraid, or simply laugh. I tossed the invitation lightly onto the desk, feeling as though someone had just pulled me into a game I never agreed to play. Rachel came in holding a moss-green smoothie she always insisted on forcing into my morning routine. Seeing the envelope already opened, she grabbed the invitation immediately. "What is this? A gala? Hosted by Russo. Wait, Russo? You mean the man with the shot dog?" I stayed silent, but my eyes spoke more loudly than words. Rachel exhaled, sat down, and shook her head. "Oh my God, Emily, what is happening? Are you going to tell me everything or not?" I told her everything in one long breath, from the way Dominic looked at Sophie, to the warmth of his voice on the phone, to the overwhelming shock I still could not shake, knowing he could still affect me after all these years. Rachel listened without interrupting, her expression shifting slowly as the pieces fell into place. Then she smiled faintly. "Well, then you have to go." I shot up. "What? No, absolutely not. I cannot go. He is Dominic. I do not know what he wants. I have a child, Rachel." Rachel crossed her arms, her expression turning sharp the way it always did when she refused to let me hide. "And because you have a child, you should go. You need to know what he really wants. Running away is not going to help. And, honestly, you want to see him again." I said nothing. Rachel stood, shrugged, then suddenly turned back and tossed a small velvet box into my hands. "The dress is ready. Size 6, navy blue. It matches your eyes. I figured you would cave." I opened the box and let out a breath somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Rachel had always known me better than I knew myself. I looked down at the invitation once more. Friday, 6 o'clock in the evening. I did not know what awaited me there, but one thing was certain. Dominic Russo never did anything without a reason, and this time, I had to be ready for whatever was coming. The sleek black limousine stopped beneath the grand entrance of the Fairmont Copley Hotel, and I tightened my grip on Sophie's hand as the driver opened the door. She wore a little white dress trimmed with lace, clutching her worn-out stuffed bear Max, her wide eyes reflecting the glow of crystal chandeliers and the flow of elegantly dressed guests moving in and out of the ballroom. A knot tightened in my stomach, Not because of the navy blue gown hugging my body or the high heels I had not worn in years, but because I was about to walk into a room where Dominic stood beneath hundreds of watchful eyes and flashing cameras. Rachel had not come with me. She said this was something I had to face alone. I drew a long breath, held Sophie's hand, and stepped inside. The ballroom opened before us like the grand hall of a palace, with soaring ceilings, cascading crystal chandeliers, and soft orchestral music drifting from the string ensemble in the corner. The tables were arranged with meticulous care, champagne glasses sparkling like carved glass in the warm golden light. The guests were people I had only ever seen printed on glossy pages: business magnates, politicians, major benefactors of the city. I felt painfully out of place. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed enchanted, her eyes shining as if she had stepped into a fairy tale. "Mama, look, there is a fountain inside the building," she whispered. I smiled, trying to quiet the unease swelling in my chest. Then I saw him, Dominic, standing at the front of the hall beside a group of people deep in conversation. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his hair neatly styled, his expression composed, though his eyes still held that familiar steely depth. He looked as though he had stepped out of the cover of a magazine, as if the world itself bent easily around him. I hesitated, instinctively wanting to turn away, but Sophie stopped, her gaze fixed on him. I looked at her and recognized the moment instantly, the moment a child's innocent eyes brushed against a truth adults spend years trying to hide. "Mama," she whispered, turning toward me, her round eyes filled with bewilderment. "That man, why does he look like me?" Before I could answer, Sophie slipped her hand from mine and moved forward. My heart leapt violently. "Sophie, come back here," I hissed, but she had already slipped, through the crowd, heading straight toward Dominic. He had his back turned. Sophie reached out and touched the sleeve of his tuxedo. Dominic turned. For several suspended seconds, the world simply stopped. He looked down at the child who had touched his arm, taking in her deep brown eyes, her soft chestnut hair, her small face lit with a strikingly familiar expression. Sophie tilted her head and spoke, her voice clear and unguarded, a bell-like sound that somehow pierced the hum of the room. Are you my dad?" Conversations around us faltered. A few people stopped chewing, turning their heads. A server nearly dropped a tray of champagne flutes. Dominic froze. He stood completely still, his eyes locked on Sophie, his mouth parting slightly as though words refused to form. I rushed over, my pulse pounding like a war drum, took Sophie's hand, and pulled her gently toward me. "Sophie, you cannot do that," I whispered, trying to steady my voice, but it was too late. Every gaze was already pinned to us. Dominic remained motionless, as if someone had struck him squarely in the chest. At last he bent down, slowly. "What is your name?" Sophie, unbothered by the weight of the moment, answered as simply as if she were introducing herself on a playground. "My name is Sophie, Sophie Carter. Mama says my dad does not live nearby. But you look so much like me. Like in a mirror." Dominic drew in a long breath and looked at me. This time there was no confusion in his eyes, only recognition, truth, undeniable and vivid. I could not speak. My throat felt sealed shut. Beneath the warm lights of the lavish gala, surrounded by hundreds of powerful and polished people, the most fragile truth was spoken by an 8-year-old child. Dominic raised his hand and gently touched Sophie's shoulder, as though any firmer touch might make her disappear. "Sophie," he murmured, then lifted his gaze to mine. "It is true, isn't it?" I nodded, barely, but enough. And in that moment, beneath the music and the chandeliers, I understood that none of us would ever return to where we once stood. I did not know how I ended up in the private room that followed, only that the music from the ballroom grew distant as Dominic placed a hand lightly against my back and murmured that we needed to talk. A staff member led Sophie to the children's play area, where several caretakers watched over a small group. Dominic guided me down a marble corridor, up a quiet flight of stairs, and into a secluded room with heavy curtains, soft lighting, and an open bottle of wine resting on the table. He closed the door, then stood still, watching me for a very long moment. I did not meet his eyes. I stood there with my hands clasped tightly, my heart pounding, unsure whether it was anger or old wounds rising to the surface. "I knew the moment I saw her," he began quietly, his voice steady but low. "I do not need a DNA test. Those eyes, that smile, She looks too much like me for me to deny. I stayed silent. He stepped closer, careful to keep enough distance not to overwhelm me, but close enough to keep me from escaping the truth between us. Emily, he said my name for the first time in nearly a decade. I did not leave because I wanted to. My hands tightened, my eyes burning. Then why? Do you have any idea what I went through? Do you know what it is like to be pregnant alone? To give birth in a hospital with no one there? To raise a child by myself while juggling school, rent, formula, bills? Do you know how many nights I stayed awake when Sophie had a fever because I was terrified I would fall asleep and not hear her cry? Dominic's face shifted, as if each word struck him full force. I was forced to leave, he said slowly. I had no choice. My father, he was the head of the organization I now run. He found out about us and threatened to hurt you unless I ended things immediately. I stared at him, stunned. What did you say? Dominic lifted his eyes, the seriousness in them undeniable. My father did not want me tangled with an ordinary student, someone outside the family, as he put it. He said you would become a weakness, a target. And he did not make empty threats, Emily. A week after I cut ties, my closest friend, the only person who knew about you, was hit by a car, every trace wiped clean. The police said it was an accident, but I knew it was a message. I stepped back, shaken. Dominic stepped forward, urgent. I disappeared to protect you. I believed that if I stayed away, you would go on with your life and stay safe from everything I was forced to carry. I did not know you were pregnant. If I had known, I swear to God, I would never have left. My throat tightened painfully. I wanted to hold on to my anger, but his voice carried an ache I could not ignore, and his eyes, there was nothing in them but truth. I turned away, overwhelmed. Then why are you back? Out of guilt? Duty? Or because Sophie looks too much like you to pretend anymore? Dominic quietly poured wine into 2 glasses but did not lift his. I came back because I have lost too much already, and I cannot lose again. Sophie is my daughter. You owe me nothing, but she deserves a father. I did not know what to say. I only knew I wanted to cry but could not. My emotions spun wildly. Love and anger and grief and longing tangled until I could barely breathe. Dominic set the glass down and stepped closer, his voice gentle. I do not expect forgiveness. I only ask to be present. Before I could speak, a loud explosion rumbled from the ballroom below. The floor trembled. Both of us jolted. Dominic's expression shifted instantly, sharp and cold. Someone pounded on the door, and Mason, a tall man in a dark suit, burst inside. Sir, we have a problem. An intruder came in through the back kitchen. We are handling it. Dominic turned to me, his voice firm. You need to stay with me. We are leaving now. Where is Sophie? The children's room, I gasped. 3rd floor. Dominic signaled Mason and took my hand, pulling me down the hallway. Footsteps thundered, radios crackled, shouts echoed in the distance, and in that moment I understood this was no longer a gala. It was a battlefield, and we were trapped at the center, with the truth between us still hanging unfinished in the air. The armored vehicle sped through the Boston night, tires screeching as it swerved sharply to avoid an intersection where police cars had blocked the road. I held Sophie tightly against my chest, feeling the trembling breaths rising and falling beneath her ribs. Dominic sat across from us, his eyes locked on the small screen showing the rear surveillance feed. His face sharpened into a cold and unyielding mask, nothing like the young man I once knew in college, or the man who whispered our daughter's name less than an hour earlier. Beside him, Mason listened to the radio, issuing commands in a low, urgent voice. We still have 2 suspects unaccounted for. One breached the back fence, but none of them are tailing us, Mason reported. Dominic nodded, glanced toward me, and said, We will reach the estate in 10 minutes. It is completely secure. There is a panic room, armed security, triple-layer surveillance. I wanted to argue, to insist I did not need his protection, that my daughter and I had survived all these years without Dominic Russo, but the truth was my hands were shaking. Sophie was clinging to me with all her strength, and something deep within me cried out for safety, not for myself, but for her. The vehicle turned onto a secluded forest road and slowly approached a set of automated iron gates. The estate emerged behind towering pines, rising like a modern fortress in the stillness of nature. Soft amber lights washed over gray stone walls, giving the place an air of both strength and isolation. When the vehicle stopped, Dominic opened the door and turned back to me. "Follow me. Keep Sophie in your arms." I said nothing, only stepped after him. Through a wide hallway padded with thick carpeting, our footsteps nearly silent. We passed a large door as Dominic entered a code on a recessed panel. A section of the wall slid open to reveal a narrow passage lit by hidden LED lights. He signaled me forward. The panic room sat deep beneath the estate, fortified like a military shelter. Inside it was compact but fully equipped. Beds, clean water, emergency supplies, an independent ventilation system, surveillance monitors, and a secure communication line. Dominic closed the door behind us, his composure almost unnervingly steady. "Stay here for now. I will personally oversee the security sweep until every last one of them is contained." I sat on the bed, Sophie still trembling but now glancing around with timid curiosity. "Mama, where are we?" she whispered. I stroked her hair gently. "The safest place for you to sleep tonight." Dominic knelt in front of her, his eyes softening in a way that caught me off guard. "I am sorry I scared you, little princess," he said quietly. "I promise it will not happen again." Sophie studied him, then looked to me as if searching for permission. I gave a small nod. She curled into my lap, but her gaze remained on Dominic. There was something in her eyes that pierced me, half the instinct of a child finding her father for the first time, half a longing she had never known how to name. Dominic stood, retrieved a soft wool blanket from a hidden drawer, and draped it over us. He hesitated before speaking again. The attacker was not an amateur. The method, the timing, the entry point, none of it was random. This was not a message. I lifted my head. "You know who it is, don't you?" He met my eyes, and something darkened in his own. "I have a few ideas, but there is one name I cannot shake." He did not say it, but in his voice I heard not only anger but a deep, old hatred waking up from years of quiet. Dominic turned toward the steel door. "Rest. I am not leaving this floor until the situation is over." The door sealed behind him with a low, heavy click, and the room fell quiet. I lay there holding Sophie, feeling her heartbeat slowly settle, while mine refused to follow. I knew the moment Dominic re-entered my life, the past had stopped being the past. It had crept into the present, wearing the shape of a storm, and I did not know whether I could withstand what was coming. Morning in Dominic's estate broke through faint beams of sunlight filtering past thick curtains. The panic room had been unlocked at dawn, and a stern but courteous woman named Claire guided me upstairs. Sophie had almost forgotten the fear of the night before, running eagerly after Buddy, a small gray dog wagging its tail down the hallway. I walked behind her, still tense, yet unable to ignore the serene and almost surreal order that filled the expansive home. Every room carried the quiet grandeur of old-world architecture mixed with understated luxury, lined with polished wood and tall bookshelves that reached toward crown-molded ceilings. Dominic waited in the dining room, wearing a crisp white shirt, sipping coffee. He rose when we entered, his eyes landing on Sophie first before drifting toward me. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" I nodded and sat in the chair. A staff member pulled out. Sophie climbed into the seat beside me, her curious eyes taking in every detail. Dominic smiled gently at her. "And what would you like to do today?" Sophie tilted her head, cautious but not withdrawn. "Do you have a garden?" Dominic set his cup down. "There is a rose garden and a pony paddock behind the house. If you want, after breakfast we can go riding." Sophie's eyes widened in awe. "I have never ridden a horse." Dominic smiled, warm in a way that felt impossibly familiar. "Then today will be the first time." I sat still, watching this strange, delicate conversation unfold between the father she had never known and the child he had met less than 24 hours earlier. Yet there was something between them already, an invisible thread slowly weaving itself together. After breakfast, Dominic led Sophie to the garden, where a trainer waited with 2 ponies. I followed, my shoes soft against the stone path that curved behind the estate. Sophie wore a small helmet, her laughter bright as the brown pony took its first gentle steps across the grass. Dominic walked beside her, holding the reins, patiently guiding her with quiet instructions. I watched them from a distance, the sight striking something deep and tender inside me. It was a scene I almost could not bear to blink away. With every slow step of the pony, Dominic seemed to move closer to a world he had lost, the world of Sophie, of me, of the life he never had the chance to touch. By midday, we returned indoors. Sophie was taken upstairs for her nap, while Claire escorted me to a spacious office Dominic had prepared for me to use. A stack of folders sat neatly on the desk, He said you may look through these if you like, Claire said before leaving. I sat down and opened them. Contracts, building permits, financial summaries, but one folder was clipped separately, labeled Willow Haven Initiative. I opened it. Inside was a proposal for a network of free veterinary clinics in low-income communities throughout Massachusetts, modeled after Willow Haven, the very clinic where I worked. In the notes section, I saw Dominic's handwriting. Idea from Emily, ask her later about operational needs and real demand. My heart tightened. He had been paying attention far more than I ever realized. I closed the folder, overwhelmed by a tangle of emotions. Dominic knocked softly before stepping inside, carrying 2 cups of tea. I figured you might want something gentler than coffee, he said, setting a cup before me. I could not find the right words. In the soft afternoon light, with Sophie's laughter echoing faintly from upstairs and steam rising from the cup between my hands, I understood something quietly and undeniably true. Dominic's world was not made solely of steel and power as I once believed. Somewhere inside it, a warmer corner had survived the years, and perhaps that corner had always been meant for me. And now, slowly, through the footsteps of the daughter we shared, it was coming alive again. That night, after Sophie had fallen fast asleep in the cream-colored bedroom meant just for her, curled around Max beneath the soft glow of a dim lamp, I stepped onto the back balcony of the estate, where the wind drifted gently through the maple trees, carrying the scent of damp nightgrass and roses settling into the mist. Dominic was already there, leaning against the stone railing, one hand resting around a glass of wine while the other stayed in his pocket. Moonlight brushed across his face, revealing the tired but steady lines of a man holding a decision that was both burdensome and inevitable. I walked to his side without speaking. We stood together in silence for several minutes, letting the space between us say everything that words could not. Then Dominic spoke, his voice low and quiet. "How do you think Sophie is doing?" I glanced up toward the window of her room, where she slept soundly with Max tucked beneath her chin, as if nothing frightening had ever happened. "She is happy," I said softly. "I have never seen her smile as much as she did today." Dominic nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting though not quite forming a full smile. For the first time in years, I felt something that actually meant something. I turned to him. "And what did the past years mean to you?" Dominic met my gaze without flinching. "Survival, fighting, doing whatever it took to keep myself alive and keep worse men from taking everything I had." There was a hint of bitterness beneath his words, but also a cold, plain truth. I remembered what he told me about his father, about the power structure behind the name Dominic Russo, and suddenly I understood why a part of him had stayed locked away for so long. "Do you want to change?" I asked, not expecting an easy answer. Dominic set the glass down on the railing and turned fully toward me. "I have been thinking about that since the moment I found out I had a child. But today, watching Sophie laugh, seeing you walk through this house, moving through everything I have built, I know I do not want to keep living the way I have." His voice lowered, firm and unshaken. "I want out." I exhaled, unsure whether to trust or to doubt him. "You know it is not that simple. Your world does not let people walk away." Dominic nodded. "I know, but I have been preparing for a long time. I have already begun handing off certain operations, turning several companies legitimate, investing in education, medicine, and animal welfare. The Willow Haven Initiative is only one piece. The people closest to me, people like Mason, they already know and support it." I stared at him, surprised. "When did you start all of this?" Dominic looked out into the dark yard, his expression distant. "The day Charlie was shot. That dog was not the target. I was. And when I saw his blood on my hands, when I carried him through the night trying to find somewhere safe, I thought of you. I remembered what it felt like to have something worth protecting. Not for gain, not for power, but for love. I found your clinic. It was not by accident. I needed to see you, even if it was only to know you were still alive." I bit my lip. "And when you saw Sophie?" Dominic let out a quiet, shaken laugh. "I lost my bearings, and I found myself again." The night breeze sent a chill across my skin, and I shivered slightly. Dominic noticed and slipped off his jacket, draping it around my shoulders with a gesture so familiar it hit me with a force I had forgotten I could feel. "I do not know if you will ever forgive me," he said softly, "but I know that if I continue living the way I was, forgiveness will not matter. I want to live right, for you, for Sophie, for myself." I did not speak. I simply stood there, letting the wind lift my hair, feeling his hand rest gently at the small of my back, warm and solid, as though we had never lost each other at all. And in that moment, I did not need promises. I only needed to believe that the man standing beside me was truly trying, not just to come back, but to become the father our daughter could someday be proud to claim. I called Rachel the next morning while Sophie played with the little gray dog in the garden. Her voice was bright as always, but shifted instantly when I mentioned the phrase money laundering. I told her everything over the next half hour, from Dominic's intention to change, to the danger creeping in, to the contracts I had seen scattered across the desk in his study. Rachel remained silent for a long time, then told me with clear, level certainty that I needed to be cautious, that men like Dominic, even those who want out, rarely walk away unscathed. She agreed to help me investigate, not because she trusted him, but because she wanted Sophie and me safe. We need to know who he is up against, and how deep he is in, Rachel said. Because if someone does not want Dominic to change, we need to know who they are before they strike again. I asked her to come to the estate that afternoon. Dominic agreed immediately when I told him she was the one person I trusted more than anyone. He gave us permission to use his private office, to access the internal storage system, but warned me carefully that some files might have been altered or planted by someone inside his old circle. Rachel arrived precisely on time, carrying her laptop, an external drive, and the same sharp, discerning gaze she always brought into anything serious. She worked as if she were conducting a full criminal investigation, and in truth, she was. Do you have any idea how many companies are registered under Russo Holdings across the state? More than 30, she muttered as she scrolled through the list. But only a few of these do actual business. I hovered behind her, anxious and curious. Rachel pointed to a small company named Viridian Logistics, based on the outskirts of Boston, listed as dealing in medical equipment, transport, and organic food distribution. But strangely, its revenue had doubled every month for the past half year, despite having no expansion campaigns and no visible marketing or public presence. Rachel narrowed her eyes. Do you see the problem? I nodded slowly. Unusual growth, no public activity, and I stopped short when a cash flow report came up on the screen. Money withdrawn weekly, listed as consulting fees, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Rachel quickly extracted the data, cross-matching it with a list of individuals and intermediary firms. Several of these accounts are linked to funds in the Cayman Islands, she murmured. Classic, the exact structure laundering operations use. Hide behind legitimate business activity, pull small amounts regularly, fly under the radar. We dug through tax filings, formation dates, contract logs. Then we found it. Viridian had been created only 6 months after Dominic began shifting his operations toward legitimacy. Rachel looked up sharply, her voice like a blade. Do you see it? Someone is using Dominic, someone inside. They built a shell under his name and used the credibility of his new business front to keep laundering money in secret. My heart sank. And he does not know? If he knew, he would have already shut it down. But if he does not, then someone close to him is powerful enough to move beneath him. That is not easy. I remembered the tension in Dominic's face recently, the short, clipped phone calls, the moments he withdrew to private corners, the quiet heaviness in his eyes when he watched Sophie and me from the garden. He was carrying far more than I realized. Rachel saved all the data onto her external drive and closed her laptop. We have enough to open a preliminary investigation. But if Dominic truly wants out, he will have to use everything we found to fight back. He will have to face the people who were once his allies. I nodded, a deep weight settling in my chest. I knew this would push Dominic into danger, but I also knew there was no longer a path behind us. If he wanted a life with us, if he wanted to become the father Sophie deserved, he would have to strip away the shadows he once lived in, even if it meant risking every piece of power he had ever held. Dominic entered the room as we were packing up. He glanced at us, then at the external drive in Rachel's hand, and did not ask a single question. I stepped toward him and placed my hand gently on his shoulder. We found a lead. But you have to be ready. Dominic nodded, his eyes steady and unyielding. I am always ready. As long as you and Sophie are safe. And in his eyes, I saw not only the resolve of a man protecting his family, but a quiet promise that this time, he would not disappear. I spent the entire next morning sitting in Dominic's study, surrounded by thick folders, computer screens filled with dense spreadsheets, and financial reports crowded with endless numbers. Rachel had left the night before, taking a duplicate of the data to send to a trusted friend in the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Dominic had not asked her a single additional question. He had simply said one sentence before she walked out the door. "Thank you for protecting Emily." He had never thanked anyone with that kind of sincerity, and from the look in Rachel's eyes, I knew she sensed something in him had begun to shift. I opened a new folder tucked deep inside the drawer, unmarked except for a faint embossed symbol, Altus. The moment I opened it, I sensed something different. These were not shadowy charts or covert accounts. Instead, I found detailed plans for commercial centers, private hospitals, affordable housing complexes, and especially large-scale investments in renewable energy. There were carbon comparison charts, community consultation reports, and educational outreach proposals for low-income neighborhoods. I turned to the last page and froze when I found the list of principal stakeholders. Dominic's name came first, but below it were 3 nonprofit organizations I recognized from articles about urban redevelopment. Each one held significant influence in the philanthropic landscape. I sat still, my heartbeat quickening. Dominic had not simply walked away from his old world. He had been quietly rebuilding himself for far longer than I had ever imagined. No publicity, no dramatic announcements. Everything moved slowly, deliberately, as if he knew that stepping too fast would collapse the tower he had carefully begun to build. Then I noticed a smaller leather-bound folder labeled Willow Haven Phase 2. Inside was a draft expansion of the free veterinary clinic model, including satellite branches across multiple cities. Each site had individual operational plans, infrastructure, layouts, staffing projections, maintenance funds, and a list of potential investors. At the very end was Dominic's handwriting in blue ink, simple and clear, for Emily, for Sophie, for everything worth keeping. My hands tightened around the page, a swell of emotion rising through my chest. Not grief, not anger, but something close to gratitude, to trust. Dominic entered just as I was reading the final lines. He stood in the doorway without interrupting, as though he understood I needed time to absorb the truth he had never spoken aloud. I lifted my eyes to him, no longer hiding my thoughts. "How long have you been working on this?" Dominic came closer and sat beside me, his fingers brushing the edge of the folder. "I started 3 years ago, after seeing what happened to people who tried to walk away without preparing themselves. I did not want to die in the dark. I wanted to build something real, something untouched by fear or greed." I nodded quietly. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because I was not sure I would make it to the end. And if I failed, I did not want to drag you down again." I placed my hand on the folder and looked directly at him. "But now, you are not walking alone anymore." Dominic held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No, not anymore." The room fell into a quiet so profound it felt sacred. Through the wide window, I could see Sophie at a little outdoor table, painting with watercolors, her hands smeared with blue and green, her hair blowing lightly in the breeze. A sparrow perched on the railing nearby before taking flight. I looked back at the man beside me, the man who had once vanished as if he had never existed, but was now sitting here, flesh and bone, with real choices and a heart learning how to love properly. And for the first time in a very long time, hope no longer felt like an impossible luxury. I was closing the Willow Haven folder when Dominic received an urgent call. He motioned for me to stay in the study and stepped into the hallway, his expression changing in an instant. A minute later, Mason appeared at the door, holding a black envelope. Without a word, he placed it on the desk, nodded once, and stepped out. I opened the envelope, and the moment the first photograph fell into my hand, my heart stopped. It was Sophie, standing in front of the temporary elementary school we had enrolled her in for the week, wearing her cream-colored coat, hair tied high, lunchbox with Little Max printed across the front, clutched in her hand. But what froze my blood was the angle. Someone had been standing very close, hidden among trees across the street, using a long lens to photograph her as though tracking her every movement. The second picture was worse. Sophie laughing in the schoolyard, but surrounded by unfamiliar faces, and not a single trusted adult nearby. I squeezed the photograph, panic rising like a tidal wave. Dominic entered the room just as my tears broke. He looked at the photos spread across the desk, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with a fury and fear so sharp it cut through the air. He turned to Mason, his voice low but edged with steel. Double the security around Sophie. Pull every camera feed near the school and surrounding neighborhoods. Get the special response team into position. From this moment, no one, not even a teacher, gets near her without a full background check. I reached for Dominic's hand. Who did this? Dominic met my eyes, and something heavy settled behind his gaze, something that told me the name was far from unfamiliar. Victor, he said. He used to control one of the strongest branches of the old organization on the West Coast. When I started transitioning out, he fought it bitterly. I thought I had cut all ties after forcing him out of the council, but clearly, he did not accept defeat. I remembered the look in Dominic's eyes when he spoke of the past, of the men who would never allow him to walk away peacefully. And now it was happening again, but this time, the price was not just Dominic's life, it was my daughter's safety. Dominic made a brief, urgent call, each word clipped with authority. Then he turned back to me, his voice softening but still grave. I am sorry I did not stop this sooner. But I promise you, Sophie will be safe. We will not let him touch her. Not even a single hair. I nodded, my eyes still locked on the photos, my chest swirling with fear, rage, and something deeper. I had thought I was used to being a single mother, used to protecting my child from the world, but nothing prepares you for the moment you see your child stalked by a stranger, turned into a pawn in a power struggle you never chose to be part of. Dominic stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. I will not let the past drag you and Sophie down with me. Victor thinks he can use her to threaten me, but that mistake is what exposes him, and this time, I will end it. I looked up at him and saw not just determination in his eyes, but a long-buried fury finally awakening. Dominic Russo had once been a man the underworld feared, and now, with a family to protect, he was no longer fighting for power, he was fighting for love. And I knew, with chilling clarity, Victor had chosen the wrong enemy. The private meeting took place that evening in the mansion's library, where Dominic gathered Mason, Rachel, and a former federal financial crime investigator who now served as his private counsel. I sat at the head of the table beside Dominic, my hand still gripping the photos of Sophie, like a reminder that everything we were doing was no longer theory but my daughter's actual life. Rachel opened her laptop and laid out the link between Victor and the shell company Viridian Logistics. She broke down each transfer, the small but steady withdrawals from the parent company into the subsidiaries under false names, and finally the stream of money disappearing into foreign investment funds with no traceable origin. The problem was that almost all transactions were carried out under the legal identity of one man, Dominic Russo. Dominic stared at the screen, unblinking, his jaw tightening. Victor used your name as a mask, laundering money through a shell you had no control over. Each transaction looks legitimate. Without contradicting evidence, the law will call you the primary operator. The lawyer's voice remained calm. But if we prove you were the victim of an internal deception, the narrative shifts. Rachel nodded. The issue is we need a link, a single thread Victor missed, something beyond spreadsheets and forged papers. I looked at Dominic, and suddenly remembered the night he brought Charlie to the clinic with a wound that was clearly no accident. The pet shop? I whispered. Everyone turned toward me. That night, Charlie was not just injured. Dominic said he was being followed, ambushed. It happened exactly when he began transitioning into legitimate work. I went to the filing cabinet and pulled an old folder from my clinic records. I had kept copies of certain medical reports because of liability concerns when injuries seemed suspicious. I took out Charlie's file. It contained photos of the wound, the uneven cut consistent with a knife, not a collision. Rachel held the page, her eyes lighting up. If we prove it was not an accident but part of Victor's intimidation to keep Dominic trapped, then this becomes pivotal. The lawyer agreed, and if there is surveillance footage around the shop that night, we may identify who shadowed him. Mason made a call, and 15 minutes later security returned with an old hard drive from the shop's system months earlier. They loaded the footage. Dominic appeared in the clip with visible tension, carrying Charlie inside. But the crucial detail was the dark SUV parked 3 houses down, lights off, someone in the driver's seat holding a recording device. Rachel zoomed in on the license plate. Mason checked it, against the vehicle registry. This SUV appeared in a prior smuggling investigation in Long Island. The registered owner is suspected to be connected to Victor. A heaviness settled over the room, as though the final pieces had clicked into place. Dominic folded his arms, eyes fixed on the screen. Victor set the trap early. He made me believe I still controlled everything while planting his own men inside, running shell companies, using my name to keep the money flowing. Rachel's voice hardened. We have part of the counterplan, but we need cooperation from federal authorities. And Dominic, you will have to publicly testify against Victor. Dominic nodded without hesitation. I will. Not just for myself, but for Sophie. If necessary, I will testify. And if I must sacrifice every dollar to protect her, I will do it without a moment's doubt. I looked at him, truly seeing the father in him, the man ready to lay everything down. This time, Dominic was not fighting ghosts of the past. He was fighting for the future he had once lost. A few days later, the legal strategy was set in motion. Dominic and his attorney met federal investigators in a closed-door session deep inside a Boston office. No recorders, no reporters, only pressure, tension, and stacks of organized documents. Dominic began by voluntarily surrendering everything he had: the Viridian files, the original Shell Company documents, and the surveillance showing the SUV trailing him on the night Charlie was injured. His attorney explained in detail how he had been manipulated by the remnants of his former organization, highlighting suspicious internal transfers and forged signatures. Rachel provided her data, including financial links between Victor and offshore funds. The meeting lasted more than 3 hours. When it ended, the lead agent stood, shook Dominic's hand, and said one sentence I will never forget. You chose the hard path, but it is the right one. That afternoon, the operation activated. Federal agents and local police simultaneously raided 4 locations in 3 states. Within 6 hours, 12 individuals were arrested, including 2 former high-ranking allies from Dominic's past. Victor, the man behind it all, was taken into custody at a lakeside mansion in Vermont, where he was preparing to flee with a lover and a fake passport. The news spread rapidly, headlines erupting with talk of an inside rebellion, and Dominic Russo's stunning withdrawal from the underworld. But what struck me most was not the headlines, it was Dominic's composure. He did not hide. He did not boast. He faced the press in a light gray suit, calm-eyed, offering no excuses. In a brief statement at his attorney's office, he spoke only a few lines. He accepted responsibility for allowing his name to be used by dangerous men, and he expressed his desire to rebuild a life with transparency and integrity. I am not the man I was 10 years ago, he said quietly. I am a father, and a father does not surrender when his daughter is threatened. That night, we returned to the mansion. Sophie was asleep, guarded by a newly vetted security team Dominic trusted completely. I found him alone in the library, staring into the backyard garden. When he turned toward me, his face was calm, but something deeper flickered behind his eyes. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. His body softened as though part of his burden lifted, his arms holding me tighter than ever. It is done, he whispered. Victor will never touch you or Sophie again. I nodded, my face at his shoulder. And what about you? Can you touch your own life again? He drew back slightly, looking straight into me. I am learning to, every day, because of you, because of Sophie, because facing the past is the only way forward. The next morning, Dominic formally relinquished all authority over companies tied to the underworld and transferred oversight to a government-controlled restructuring board. He kept only 2 entities, a construction firm specializing in affordable housing and a community development fund named the Sophie Grace Foundation. Everything else, he willingly let go. Dominic Russo, once called the Shadow of the East, stood openly in the light at last, and for the first time, I believed he was truly moving in the right direction. No more secrets, no more blood, only the courage of a father choosing to surrender power so he could hold on to what mattered most, his family. That afternoon the sky was crystalline, spring sunlight spreading gently across the deep green lawn behind the mansion. Newly blossomed peach flowers glimmered pink in the soft breeze, creating a serenity that felt worlds away from the storms we had endured. Dominic texted me to come outside, saying there was something he wanted Sophie and me to see. I held her hand as we stepped into the garden, a quiet flutter of anticipation stirring in me. On the grass, between 2 tall rows of maples, a small table covered in a white cloth stood waiting, with 3 cupcakes and a pot of warm chamomile tea. Buddy, loyal and sleepy, lay in the shade nearby. Dominic stood beside the table in a white shirt, his expression gentle, his eyes glowing like early summer light. Sophie squealed at the sight of the treats and rushed forward. Does it have chocolate? Dominic pulled out a chair for her and smiled. It has chocolate and vanilla. Today is special. After all, I looked around, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. Everything was arranged with care, the tiny vase of flowers, the embroidered cloth with all three of our names stitched in silver thread. Dominic handed me a cup of tea, his gaze lingering warmly. "Emily," he began, his voice low but steady. "When I stepped out of the shadows, I did not know what I would find on the other side. I did not know whether a life outside that world had room for a man like me. But then I saw you, and I saw Sophie, the only light that never judged me, never demanded, never bargained. And that is what saved me. I could barely breathe." Sophie sat still, watching us with wide eyes. Dominic rose, walked to me, and knelt on one knee in the soft grass. From his pocket he pulled a deep blue velvet box. Inside was a simple ring, set with a teardrop sapphire, luminous yet understated. "I have no perfect promises," he said softly, "but I have the truth. I love you. I loved you from the beginning, and I never stopped missing you. I lost you once, and I do not want to lose you again. Emily Carter, will you marry me?" I could not hold back the tears. All those lonely nights, all the years raising Sophie alone, all the moments I thought I had forgotten him, they all rose inside me at once. I could not speak. I simply nodded and fell into his arms. He held me tightly, his lips whispering at my ear. "Thank you. Thank you for believing in me again." When I looked up, Sophie stood a few steps away, clutching her cupcake as if it were treasure, her eyes round with wonder. Dominic opened his arms. "Princess, what would you think if I wanted to be your dad?" Sophie blinked slowly, then walked toward him. She looked at me first, then at him, and without the slightest hesitation, wrapped her arms around his neck. "I agree," she whispered. "As long as you love Max too." Dominic laughed, pulling both of us close. "I promise, I love Max too." And in that golden afternoon, where everything once shattered now found its way back together, I realized that real love does not need to be perfect, or loud, or wrapped in grand gestures. It only needs courage, the courage to return, to face what was broken, to choose one another again. Dominic chose Sophie and me, and this time, I knew he would never let go. The living room was flooded with early morning light as I sat before the mirror, the table in front of me covered with a handwritten list of wedding preparations that Rachel had written in her round, careful script. The dress was chosen. The flowers were ordered. Sophie would be the little bridesmaid. Dominic would be waiting for me beneath the row of maple trees where he had once knelt to propose. Everything had been arranged with such care and precision, as though every step we had taken to reach this point had been wrapped into a single moment, the day we would finally become a family. I brushed my fingers lightly over the thin veil resting beside me and felt my heart quiet itself. Not from nerves, but from remembering a long journey that still felt unreal whenever I looked back. There were mornings when I woke to an empty bed, a silent apartment, and Sophie calling for me through a nightmare. There were nights I sat alone in the clinic with only the glow of the streetlights outside, wondering if the man I had once loved ever thought of me, or of the little girl who had never been given a chance to call him father. I remembered the first time I saw Dominic standing in the doorway of the clinic, holding a bleeding dog in his arms. His eyes no longer the eyes of the man who once made my pulse race, but the eyes of someone who had survived too much darkness. And I remembered the confusion, the anger, the tug-of-war inside me, between love and fear, hope and hurt. Yet day by day, he stayed. No excuses, no attempts to hide the truth, only the steady presence of a man rebuilding love out of ruins. Dominic was no longer a name tied to power or a past steeped in shadows. He was the man who brewed tea for me every morning, who read stories to Sophie every night, who wiped my tears when I was too tired to pretend to be strong. And Sophie, who once whispered to me asking if she would ever have a father like the other children, could now run around the house calling out "Daddy," with eyes full of sparkling joy. I stood and walked out onto the balcony where spring flowers had just begun to bloom. The gentle warmth of the season wrapped itself around old memories like a soft blessing. Buddy lay beneath the tree, lazily lifting his head before drifting back to sleep. In the distance, I saw Dominic guiding Sophie along a path of petals, the little girl laughing as her dress twirled like a tiny wind chime. Sunlight shimmered across her golden hair, and Dominic watched her with a tenderness I had never seen directed at anyone else. They were my whole world, the reason I had survived days when faith felt impossible. I took a long breath, returned to the table, picked up the plan, and smiled. Maybe everything would not be perfect. Maybe rain would fall on our wedding day. Maybe petals would scatter out of place. Maybe a light somewhere would flicker. But I knew that as long as Dominic stood at the end of the aisle, and Sophie held my hand as I walked toward them, then no matter what the world brought, we would walk through it together. Because the love we had was built from loss, from mistakes, and from the courage to love again, the right way, and with the right person. That morning, the garden behind the estate glowed beneath the pale gold of spring sunlight, cherry blossoms swaying gently on the breeze, drifting over the shoulders of guests finding their seats in quiet anticipation. A line of white chairs had been arranged neatly along the path covered in flower petals, leading to an arch woven from lavender, white roses, and young maple branches, the place where I would walk toward Dominic, who waited for me with a gaze both tender and unwavering. I stood behind a thin curtain in the small room beside the garden, Sophie's hand in mine, her white dress sparkling softly as though she were stepping out of a childhood dream. Rachel adjusted my hair with a radiant smile, as if she herself were about to enter a new chapter. Dominic had kept his promise. Nothing extravagant, nothing ostentatious, only the people who had truly mattered to us, those who had witnessed this journey from heartbreak to healing, from conflict to forgiveness. The piano began to play slowly, notes drifting through the green, open air like gentle taps on memory, reminding me of every moment that had brought us to this day. When I stepped out, Sophie walked ahead with her tiny bouquet, dropping petals along the path. She looked back at me and smiled so brightly, her eyes shimmering with pride. I moved forward slowly, carrying the bouquet Dominic had sent that morning with a small note hidden inside. "Thank you for believing in love again. I will not leave again." When I reached the floral arch, Dominic turned. The look in his eyes quieted the world around us. No whispers, no shadows of past hurt. Only the man before me and a certainty deeper than any vow. I was walking toward where I truly belonged. The officiant began speaking simple blessings, touching on the small things that make love endure, a warm glance at the end of a hard day, a hand held tightly when everything falls apart, a heart wide enough to hold past mistakes and strong enough to choose love again. Dominic took my hand, his voice deep and steady as he spoke. "Emily, I once lost you because I was afraid, because I made the wrong choices, because I did not have the courage to protect what I loved most. But from the day you returned, from the moment Sophie smiled and called me Daddy, I knew I never wanted to live another day without the two of you beside me. I promised not to disappear, not to retreat, not to leave you to face the world alone. Whatever comes, I will be here, as your partner, as a father, and as a man who loves you completely." I squeezed his hand, tears shimmering in my eyes. "Dominic, there was a time I never believed a man like you would come back. I thought love was a luxury a single mother could not afford, and that the past would always remain a wound that would not heal. But you have shown me that some men not only change for love, but rise from their darkness to become a light for those they care for. I love you for who you are, who you were, and everything we will build together." When we exchanged rings, applause filled the garden. Sophie ran to wrap her arms around my legs, then threw herself into Dominic's arms with a delighted shout that made everyone laugh. "Daddy, you have to kiss Mommy." Dominic laughed, gathering us both close. When his lips touched my forehead, I knew this was not merely a wedding. This was a promise forged out of loss and regret, signed in tears and courage. A promise that from this day on, we were no longer three separate pieces, but a family, a real family. Later that afternoon, when the guests had gone, and laughter still lingered like petals on the grass, Dominic gently lifted Sophie and carried her to the small garden behind the house where he had built a wooden swing for her weeks earlier. I watched from the doorway, leaning softly against the frame, my heart as light as a dandelion carried by a child's breath. Sophie sat on the swing, gripping the ropes, her golden hair floating in the warm breeze. Dominic knelt before her and took a small cream-colored box with a pink ribbon from his pocket. The look in his eyes was not just that of a man giving a gift, but of a father pouring every piece of his heart into a moment. Sophie tilted her head, curiosity sparkling. "Is it for me?" Dominic nodded, his voice low with emotion. "It's more than a gift. It's a promise." He opened the box to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant carved with a small letter S, intertwined with a tiny star. He carefully fastened it around her neck, Sophie touched the pendant, eyes widening as if she suddenly understood something deeper. "It's so pretty," she whispered. "You chose it for me?" Dominic sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I chose it because this stone is special. It isn't the biggest or the most expensive, but it is the only one from your grandmother's collection that she never gave away. She once said she would save it for the person she believed would bring light to our family. Yesterday, when I saw you walking down the flower path, I knew she had been right." Sophie was silent for a few seconds, then asked in a small, trembling voice, "So, does that mean I'm really your daughter now?" Dominic did not answer right away. Instead, he drew her into his arms. "You have always been my daughter. No paperwork, no permission needed. I love you the way a father loves his little girl. I'll be there when you need help, when you are happy, and when you are sad. I'll listen, I'll protect you, and I'll learn how to be a father, little by little, from you." Sophie hugged him tightly, her face pressed into his chest. "I love you too," she whispered, as though afraid the magic of the moment might vanish if spoken too loudly. Dominic kissed the top of her head, then lifted his gaze toward me. Our eyes met across the fading light, and in that quiet moment I understood that nothing else was needed to complete this picture. Dominic had walked the long road of redemption not with words, but with the weight of his actions. And when he placed that necklace around her neck, he gave Sophie not just a piece of jewelry, but a lifelong vow. When I approached them, Sophie ran to me, proudly showing her new necklace. I bent down, brushed her hair back, and whispered, "You know, sweetheart, there is nothing in this world more precious than a father's heart devoted to his daughter." Sophie smiled, then reached for Dominic's hand. Her tiny fingers curled inside his much larger ones, and I knew that this was the hand that would guide her safely through every chapter of her life. And I felt my own heart warmed again by a kind of love that was no longer just romantic, but had become the very foundation of a family.